Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? How are we feeling? Partly cloudy, chance of showers or sunny? Which one?
Sure.
Sunny? Good. I'm glad. We're at the bottom part of this entirely amazing kind of conference that we're having here. My name is Andre Ward. I serve the Director of Program Operations at Common Justice. And so you warriors who have stayed behind for the remaining part of this day are joining this last panel or this breakout session, really to kind of hear about healing and accountability, or rather safety and justice without prison, applying restorative justice to violent crime. And so I had the distinct honor and pleasure to have my supervisor, my colleague and dear friend, Danielle Sered, and my other colleague, Donnell Penny, who is a part of Common Justice, to sit on this panel and to share with you some of the work that we do, in addition to hearing some of your thoughts. So my duty and my responsibility here will be to field questions from you, to kind of move the conversation along. But we certainly learned a lot today. Can we agree? I've certainly learned a lot, and we're looking to all of you as thought leaders in this room to continue to move this forward beyond the conference, right? It says beyond the bars, right? That's the name of this conference. And we're looking to really advance all of the ideas in different ways to really affect the kind of meaningful change and substantive change that we're looking for. So I'll get right to it. I don't like to kind of prolong things, and I'll kind of start with Danielle and really kind of talk to us a little about common justice. I know we've heard some of our themes that run through the work that we do, right? We talked about survivors, and we talked about this whole notion of safety and accountability and racial equity. There was also discussion around people being isolated, right? And people being looked at a certain way, around them, not being honored in different ways. And we want to hear from Danielle and like, where did this thought come from, right? It's really innovative, right? You think about it, right? Getting harmed parties together, getting responsible parties together, right? And moving those things forward in a humane kind of way. So Danielle, kind of give us some background and historical kind of information around common justice. How did it evolve and grow?
Thank you, Andre. Thank you all for sticking through the very end of a long day. I know I actually have an easier job than you do because it's actually much more demanding to listen than to talk. Because when you talk, you already know the thing you're saying, and when you listen, you have to integrate a whole thing. So listening to that second panel, the second plenary that was so powerful, is probably the hardest work I did today. So just appreciate the work it takes to be present in these kinds of things. So common justice, for those of you who don't know, we develop and advance solutions to violence that meet the needs of those harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on incarceration. And at the core of our work is an alternative to incarceration victim service program rooted in restorative justice practices that serves as the first and only alternative to incarceration for serious and violent felonies in the adult courts in the United States. And so it's a 15-month intervention. Donnell can talk more about it, as can I and Andre in the course of this conversation, that has at the heart of it a dialogue between the people who commit harm and those they harmed, where they reach agreements about what the responsible person can do to make things as right as possible. And those agreements replace the prison sentences that the responsible parties, which is what other people call offenders, would otherwise have served. And in the meantime, we provide support to the harmed parties, what others would call victims, in coming through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And the common justice came out of the sort of profound moral recognition of a couple related failures in our culture. One is the failure of incarceration to produce safety. And for those of you who were the last plenary, I got amped up about it. But incarceration is a terrible mechanism to deliver safety. It neither addresses the structural factors that create violence in the first place, like poverty and inequity, lack of economic opportunity, exposure to violence, but it also amplifies the individual level factors that drive violence: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and inability to meet one's economic needs. And so prison in that way is a recipe for disaster. So as people who care about safety, we were troubled by prison's failure to produce it. We were equally troubled by the exclusion of most crime survivors from the process addressing the harm they survived. The vast majority of survivors don't call the police. Even those who do, the cases don't typically result in an arrest. They often don't make it as far as grand jury. And even those in the few cases that do result in somebody's incarceration, most survivors find that outcome to be inadequate and sometimes counterproductive to their healing. And so the system we have doesn't do right by them either, while at the same time we see in it some of the starkest, most unconscionable racial inequities across our society. And so the combination of its profound failure to deliver safety, its failure to heal survivors, and its failure to meet the basic standards of equity that should be at the core of any democracy, meant we thought we should do something different. And so what we did is say, like, when you ask people who've been hurt what they want, like if you think about for yourself, what you, in part, like you want blood, right? Like part of you is like, I want them to suffer forever, kind of. That's real. Like that's part, like we get to have our rage. Like to be transformative justice people, we don't have to not be furious at the people who hurt us. Like they had no right to hurt us. We should not have been hurt. Like we get to still feel that. But what we want is we want our pain acknowledged. We want validation that what happened to us is wrong. Right? We want someone to say, I did that and I made a choice to do it, and how did it affect you? And I had no right. And we want to tell them what to do. Like we want to tell them where to shove it, but we also want to tell them what to do. We want to say, like, go pay me back for what you stole. Apologize. Don't apologize to me because words don't mean much to me, but apologize to my family who you've affected too. Go talk to other young people so they don't do what you did. Like, go volunteer in this place I believe in so something of what you did has a benefit to a thing I believe in so that some good in the world comes out of the pain I survived. And never, like, do the hardest work anyone can do, which is to become someone who will never do this to anyone ever again. Like, and don't talk to me until you become that person, right? Like, that's what we want. We don't get any of that from the criminal justice system. We're separated from the people who hurt us. They are encouraged to deny their guilt. We rarely get to talk at trial, and even if we do, the evidence shows that our talking has virtually no effect on sentencing. When people are incarcerated, there's virtually nothing to support accountability, and I don't mean punishment, I mean accountability. I mean when I say I did that, like expressing a responsibility for what I've done, expressing remorse, acknowledging its impact, making it right, and never doing it again. Like all of those things are not only difficult in prison, they're often interrupted by prison or diminished by prison. So the things we want as survivors are interrupted and diminished. And then when you ask those of us who commit harm, and like all of us, I've done both. Like I've hurt people and been hurt, and I challenge one person in the room. Like if I were like, everybody who has caused harm, stand over here, and everyone who's been hurt, stand over there. Like y'all would either be like in the middle, running back and forth, or lying. Right? Like, those are the only choices. Because we all, and I don't just mean criminal stuff. I mean, like, as human beings, we hurt each other. And the thing is that we talk a lot about what survivors need when we're hurt, right? The acknowledgement we need and the healing we need. Like, we know the stages of grief and how we progress through things. But what do we need when we've hurt people, right? And in part, like, what I believe, like, if you think about, I'll ask this, I know this will be a brief downer, I'm warning you, it's the end of the long day. Take a moment to think about a time that you hurt someone and made right for it. And just, take care of yourself. So think if you're tired and worn down, think of something small. Like I done took a seat on the subway and then I pretended my ankle was hurt when I saw an elder in front of me, even though my ankle was just fine, right? Like start there if you don't want to go big, or go big, right? Like, so a time you have done something that you believe was wrong, not that was illegal or against the rules, that you believe was wrong. Maybe it was illegal, maybe it was against the rules, but that's not what's important. And that you made it right somehow. So take a moment to just think about that.
There's a lot of thinking.
And so when I would venture that it's not necessarily something you want to announce to this room, right? Maybe you do. But I would venture that you can think about that and love yourself at the same time. Does that seem true? That you could think of that and make your face smile at the same time, and that might even feel kind of reasonable. And now take a moment and think about a time that you did something you know was wrong and you didn't make it right. Because you didn't have the courage, you didn't know how. By the time you did, you couldn't reach that person. The damage you caused was too great, whatever it might be. Take a moment of silence to just think about and just sit with how that feels. So I know for me that feels really different. No matter how many times I do this exercise, it's still hard to do. The best word I have for it, it's not a perfect word, but the best word I have for it is shame. It sits somewhere really close to the worst things that have been done to me that haven't been fixed. And it's a heavy thing to carry. And the only pathway I know out of shame is accountability. It's the thing that lets us feel that thing we felt like 15 seconds ago. Everyone wishes I did this exercise in the opposite order. Right? That when we make things right, because even the worst things I've done that I've made right, I can hold them differently, even of great seriousness. And the thing that accountability gives us, just like healing gives us when we are survivors, it gives us a pathway back to our dignity, to our hope, to our self-love, to our ability to love others. Similarly, when we have committed harm, accountability gives us a pathway back to our dignity, to our hope, to our self-love, to our ability to love others. Like, accountability is the thing that lifts us out of shame. And I believe that we deserve it, however hard that work is. And so common justice came out of a recognition of the profound failure of things as they are to deliver the things that they are tasked to do. And similarly, an understanding that actually the thing most survivors want is accountability. And at the end of the day, the things most people who have done harm want is accountability. And so that if we built something that had accountability at its center, that it could become a catalyst for healing, and it could also meaningfully take up the responsibility that the criminal justice system was supposed to hold and had failed to take up sufficiently.
Thank you for that, Danielle. I just wanted to kind of assess the room, right, to kind of determine, I'm sorry, Tim, I'm a little under the weather. Just got over a flu, so that's why I'm staying far away from you, right? But I'm still able to kind of communicate. But I wanted to kind of understand, like, in the room, how many people in this room are social workers, by showing of hands? Mm-hmm. How many people are working in direct service in the nonprofit world around criminal justice reform stuff? Or just direct service in general, nonprofit? How many are students in this room? I think we're all students. The classroom for us is the entire universe. But students, right? Going to school or whatever. Anybody in law enforcement in the room, if you care to disclose that. Perfectly fine, right? It's great. Just want to kind of assess the room because it's important, right? That as you hear Danielle and I and Donnell talk about this work, that it resonates, right? And it's connective in different ways. And we're not siloed, even though we may be in different spaces. And so I wanted to kind of get some context around that. Some other things, Danielle, and I'll direct it to you. Then we're going to go to Donnell and some of the more direct service work. But in common justice, what's fundamental to our work and what undergirds it essentially is this restorative justice model. Can you talk about that just a little bit, this whole notion of restorative justice, and what does that mean?
Yeah. And so with restorative justice, instead of asking the question sort of what law was broken and who should pay for it, asks like what harm was done and how can it be repaired? Whose job is it to repair it? And so it has a different relationship to harm. It's funny because it took me a long time to actually, I resisted for a long time using the phrase restorative justice. And I only do it now, honestly, because a couple of my Black elders in the field were like, we need you to start saying the word. And then I was like, there we go. But the reason I didn't use it before, we called it participatory justice at first, stubbornly, was first that we want to be honest that none of us are ever fully restored to what we were before, not for the kind of harm we talk about. Like restorative justice is often applied to things like, graffiti and shoplifting and that kind of stuff, and I think we actually can be fully restored from those things. But the kind of harm we're talking about, like having a gun pointed to your head, having your face cut open, being stabbed in your torso, you're never the same. You may actually be more powerful and more connected and more focused in your life, but the thing you won't ever be is what you were before, right? Like that is off the table after real violence. And so we wanted to be clear that we were not talking about that kind of backward-looking idea of what it was. And also because we understand that for most of our participants, the violence that brought them to common justice is not the first harm they survived. And so a lot of the restorative justice field in this country, not globally, but in this country and as called restorative justice, grew up in middle class, like white communities where there was some idea that like things were happy and healthy and whole, and then there was this like interrupting event that disrupted it. And if only we could restore to the previous moment when we were happy and healthy and whole, then all would be good again. And of course, those white families had plenty of suffering in them too, and they are not exempt from the like 1 in 4 rates of domestic violence, for example, that don't seem to see color, right? But what's true in communities of color, it's like, where would you rewind to the moment when that community was healthy and happy and whole, right? Like 1491 and a half, right? Like, where do we go? And so wanting to be clear that like it has to be a fundamentally forward-looking process, right? It has to be one that is about healing, that is about transformation, that is about carving a different path forward out of pain than the one that got us into it. But the other reason we didn't say restorative justice for a long time is restoration is a promise, right? Like to say, so our criminal justice system promises things to victims of crime all day long. Testifying, you'll feel better, you'll feel stronger, you'll feel safer, we'll protect you, like all of this, and breaks those promises over and over and over and over again. Some of those promises have no basis in evidence whatsoever. Like it is just not actually demonstrated that testifying at trial improves your mental health, for example. And yet still all the time those promises are made. And so we didn't want to be in the business of making false promises. And so when we said participatory justice, like we can promise participation. Like you come in, you curse them out, you're like, F this and leave, and you've participated, right? Like we knew we could deliver that. And so in the spirit of making, of being in integrity in our commitments to people who were hurt, we tried to use language that reflected like a promise that we could actually keep. That said, like the restorative justice movement in this country, as it takes more and more responsibility for racial equity, and as it joins more and more in the larger struggle to end mass incarceration, becomes a movement that we are proud to be part of, even if like the poet in me is cranky about the word. And so when we talk about that movement's emergence, we see in it like an enormous amount of promise for a vision that does not require us to deny the severity of pain that people survive, that does not require us to pretend that someone's background excuses the violence they caused, but rather allows us to hold whole people fully accountable for what they've done, and whole people in a process of healing through what was done to them.
And so, our work is unique, as Danielle just described. And when we look at language that we use, it's consistent with our innovation. So we don't describe the people who have been victimized as victims necessarily. We refer to them as harm parties. And conversely, those who have been responsible for that, we call them responsible parties, which is unique in and of itself, right? We know that the very moment you hear that this person is a victimizer, a perpetrator, a criminal, all those things create things in your mind that takes away from that person's humanity. Likewise, the person who has been harmed in some way, also things come in your mind, right? You look at this person like, oh, wow. I mean, you're sensitive about this person's injury, what they've experienced and sustained. But there isn't this human thing necessarily, right? And so we use harm parties and responsible parties. And I want to kind of move a little away from our harm party stuff, which we're going to get to, and talk a little about our responsible party work, right? Because it's really, really important that not only the harm party is addressed and healed, which is essentially one of the main goals of common justice, is to bring healing, not just to the harm party, but also to responsible parties. In doing so, we can restore families, we can restore communities, we can bring about a sense of peace, right, to people who've harmed and have been harmed. And so I want to talk about responsible party work. And so I want to turn to my colleague Donnell Penny here, and penny like a penny, but it's worth a lot more than a penny, of course, to kind of talk about some of the responsible party work that he does, right? He does some really direct service work, and then he does some larger work with the responsible party, many of whom are men, and some of whom are young women as well. So Donnell, the first thing I want to kind of ask is our responsible party work. What's the process like, right? The first process of an individual. You come in contact with this person, they're coming to the program, right? We have them go through an orientation and intake, then they come to you. They're assigned to work with you. What is that like for you?
First, I'll start off by saying pennies make dollars. I want to say that. Second off, I would say, of course, it's 8 to 15 months, right? the first 3 months, when they first come to me, I normally do a safety plan, right? See where they are, how they feel comfortable, even checking in with themselves, right? When you walk down this block, how do you feel, right? Those sort of things are getting them to get in the process of checking into themselves. Also seeing how they, because how can you tell somebody to do a program if they worry about their life, right? Right? Or not having certain things in order. So we try to help them to get that in order. The next thing I would say is basically going over the post curriculum, and talking to them how that will go throughout the time. Sometimes people, and even I just want to share something with y'all. I'm actually a graduate of the program, right? And I even said yes just to get out of Rikers. So, you know what I mean? We don't really think about the process of what it's going to take to be inside of this thing that we said yes to. We just knew we didn't want to be in Rikers, right? So even going back over that and being like, you know, do you know what you basically said that you would promise yourself to, what you would basically give yourself to, right? That you said that you would give back to this home party, this person that let you out of the Rikers and believed that you had something in you that can be great, right? And they wanted you to do this instead, because they believed that it was something better at the end of the road. Of course, we know that jail doesn't create great people, right? And also, I see a lot of people come out and they're internalize a lot of things that even happen in there in a short amount of time, right? So you're asking them their experiences. How do you feel when you went in? When you were in? How do you feel when you're out? How do you feel now at this moment? Most of the time, I normally, even though it don't say 1 to 10, I normally do a 1 through 10, and I'm going through a scale and like, okay, so if if you say that your anxiety is because you're scared of walking on the block and you're at an 8, right, from 1 through 10, how can we get you to that 10? What does that look like? Sometimes a person needs you to speak with them in order to go through and have options. Sometimes they don't know that they had those options. And most of the time when these guys come to us, and how I ended up there I didn't think I had those options, right? There were certain things that I learned to do. You get hurt, you hurt somebody, right? The only way to stop another person from doing it to me is to do it to somebody else quick so that you can see it and that nobody else does it again, right? So those were the things that I learned. So even like going into the men's group, right? Because one of the things I do is also the men's group. We do the post work. We go through the stuff. I say after the 3 months, let me just get to that. I'll go back to the men's group. In 3 months, after the 3 months, they have a circle. They actually sit down with the person they harmed or an actual, I forgot the word. Surrogate. I'm sorry. A surrogate, right? Somebody who is representative of that harm party, right? That can actually lift up that harm party's voice inside of that circle, and still, so the responsible party can still feel that environment, right? After that, that's when they actually get their agreements inside of the circle. Now, I believe Danielle said something about it, but it can range from a lot of things, and we heard a lot of crazy things with people that said that they wanted inside of agreement, right? Because they wanted the person that harmed them to feel some of the pain that they felt. So some of the things that happen are like, I see what you're trying to do, I see what you're asking, but what are you trying to get out of that for yourself? And how can we make that thing happen for you, right? Because we don't want to sit here and also, to the responsible party, make him feel even a certain way, even traumatize him more too, right? We're like, but how can he pay this back without it being this way, in this dramatic way, right? I'm one of the people, case coordinators, that work with the guys through their agreements and help them to go through that stuff. Most of the things are skills that they will need in life, and things that will help them to not even get back into the same stuff that they are. Sometimes it's connected to financial things, right? Everybody wants to feed their family and do things, and sometimes that's one of the things. They don't have an education. They don't have certain things that connect them towards those things, and we help them to get towards those things. We don't help anybody do anything. We assist. We are their team, but we don't help them do anything. All right. And then we go like into Move. Move is one of the things that happens throughout the time that they're there. It started off from basically domestic violence, talking about domestic violence, getting the guys to know more about domestic violence, believing that if they're in their program for something violent, that anything else can happen in other relationships, and trying to correct those things and those behaviors, right? So I don't know if y'all, do anybody know about Tony Porter? Yes, I'm about to go there. Yeah. No? You know Tony Porter? Okay, so he created something called the Man Box. Now, the reason why I always go in there about Tony Porter is because when I was in there, one of my mentors, which was a guy named Mark, he actually put on Tony Porter for me, and I lost my mind. Like, what? So let me explain to you what I mean by this, right? So there was, when I speak to the guys, there's always, I call it the glitch in the matrix, right? to let them know that we are actually doing something that was learned and we don't notice it, right? So I spoke to one of the guys and I said, do you notice every time when you walk down the block in your neighborhood, if I was to walk past you in the neighborhood, big guy, you a big guy, what would happen? Nothing. We'll look at each other and keep moving. Okay, so what would happen if a girl with something that we found to be, hip hop, body or whatever walks past us? What's going to happen? We're probably going to wink at each other. How come it takes that moment to have that communication? How come out of every other time we won't speak to each other and we're angry and we guarded, but for a woman walking past and looking at her body, we went, what was that about? Right? And they sort of, just from looking at those little pieces, they sort of, oh, okay. And it encourages them to learn more and gives them an insight that there's something there that they can dive more into, right? Most decisions are based off of not knowing consequential thinking, right? To an extent. So just building with them and having a space and an environment in which they can talk and be that way. Understanding that we don't get a lot of those places in back home, right, where we're from. We don't get a lot of that talking of being like, I'm hurt. Yo, that hurt me. Yo, son, seriously, I feel like crying right now, right? Because that's weak to an extent to some people, right? To see that's exposing yourself. So we don't want to do that. So what I do is, or what I say common justice doesn't move, right? Men opposing violence everywhere. What we do is we create a space in which the guys can have a healthy relationship with each other and hold each other accountable and pull each other up. The one thing I did do, and which I had to learn, was I jumped down the guy's throat every time he said the B word. I didn't understand yet what it meant for them to be accountable even when I wasn't looking, right? I didn't understand that they had to do that without me being around, right? I'm like, no, don't say that. We're trained, we're putting people in a position where we understand that this is not just a common justice thing. This is a life thing. So when this person leaves, they have to take these same skills and use them in their communities and their circles as well. They have to take these skills and grow as well. So we have to help them create those tools in order to do those things outside. We're not going to do those things for them. We're not with them 24/7. They have to live their life. They have to move. They're grown adults, right? They have to do those things. And we're helping them to navigate and create those tools and have those tools and those options on the table. Because once again, growing up, for me, I know violence was the answer to me not being bothered. Me being like, let me show them I'm crazy before they come to me was the thing that stopped people from bothering me. You know what I mean? And I never got a chance to say how it hurt me or how I was affected or why I didn't walk down a certain block. You know what I mean? My mother would say, go to C-Town. I'm like, no, I'm going to this one right here. What's in beef? And you know what I mean? Like, and didn't get to have those conversations. So we help them to have that space and have that and create that safe space and also be able to replicate that safe space when they go somewhere else and do it.
Thank you, Donnell. And fundamental to our work is really about accountability. Those who are responsible parties ultimately understand how we put at the front of our engagement with them being culpable and responsible for the decisions that they've made that has negatively impacted the life of another human being. That's a large part of our work with the responsible party. And we're grateful to work with the DA's office and others in partnership to see that through, that we can get these people, right, in front of a judge, right, in a way that we can work on them being fully accountable for what they've done to ultimately begin to be a better person so they don't have to go before a judge again ever in their lives. So this process that Donnell described has all to do with that. And it just doesn't mean that, we prepare this individual to go before their harm party or a surrogate necessarily. We also bring the family members in, right, to be a part of the supportive circle, which we deem more of a rites of passage kind of experience, because the individual who's the responsible party has a family, just like the harm party. And all too often, our younger people who are responsible parties come from really broken homes that are challenged, right, and need different interventions. And so not only is there healing for the responsible party when they're in this support group with their families, it's healing for the families themselves who also have experienced trauma and pain. And so while we're talking about the responsible parties, and we'll get back to them a little bit later, Danielle, I want to kind of talk about the harm parties, right? Because that's also very, very important and critical to our work. And all of what we do has all to do with them as well. And so I know with our harm parties, the work that we do with them is we also create plans for them as well. We work with them individually to assess what their needs are, right? And with their own input, obviously, and with their buy-in, we support them in the things that they're interested in. So talk to me about Healing Works, Danielle, and how that came about as we're working with harm parties.
So Healing Works is a national learning collaborative for people working with young men of color who've been harmed by violence and trauma. About 70% of the harm parties we serve are men of color. That's not because we specially target men of color. It's because that's who's most likely to be hurt by violence in this country. Like a young black man is 10.5 times more likely than me to be robbed or assaulted, even though it's still pictures of people like me on all the victim service posters. And so when we started Common Justice, we understood that the people to whom we would be providing victim services were people that our country has never seen as victims of crime, right? Has never seen of people who are in need of care and protection. And that the question of what victim services would look like, the answer would be different than when we asked what it should look like for me. Like for each of us, the way we heal is rooted in who we are and where we're from. And like what makes us feel whole and right has to do completely with our culture. And so the existing network of victim services are very culturally competent for white people, right? Like they are designed to reflect, especially the ways in which like we often seek privacy and separation for our healing, right? Like we want to be most vulnerable away from as many people as possible. And we like professionals, right? We want somebody who has a certain kind of authority that has been endowed by an institution, right? Like they have a degree. We want the one with the best degree. Like you'll hear white families being like, we took our kids to the best psychiatrist, to the best psychotherapist. And by the best, it means like the one with the Harvard degree and the this and that, right? And we think that if we have those people with those credentials and we are alone with those people and not visible to others, that's where we'll be able to move through our pain. And for many of us, we can and do. That's a cultural thing, right? And so, like, that's not a universal thing. That has to do also with how white folks react to each other in groups when we express weakness and pain, right? Like, we can be an extremely punishing people with each other. Like, I often say that the one thing I don't usually think that people of color underestimate the like cruelty or harm of white people, but I do think folks of color often underestimate how unkind white folks can be to each other. That the features we have baked into our institutions are not one we just invented for other people. They are also ones that show up in our families and our ways of dealing. And so our ways of healing are rooted in those features of our culture. It means that what a young man of color in America is going to want to come through pain is going to be different from what I want. And so Healing Works grew out of, like, we got some really big national recognition from Attorney General Eric Holder, as far as I'm concerned, is still Attorney General. And it was sort of horrifying because we were small and we were failing as often as we were succeeding and we were new. And yet we're getting this, where there's like a whole fanfare, we get this big award. And we went, at that point, we began a mission to eradicate our uniqueness, right? Like to make sure that our ragtag little program in Brooklyn was not the only or the best program providing victim services to young men of color, but that we did what's necessary, which is to find all the people everywhere who are tending to young men of color's pain, because communities of color would not still be here today if that care work weren't happening. And to drive resources to that work, to learn from that work, to learn with that work, like to be in community and partnership with people who know what it takes to help someone come through pain. So our colleague Charlene Allen, who couldn't be here today, built Healing Works from the ground up, like with that framework in mind. And our colleague Mike Rowe runs it now. And that work is designed to like really create a new, like a healing practice for young men of color. And so what we do in Common Justice, though, is in addition to our participants, our harm parties, getting to participate in the circle with the responsible party, we also provide them with wraparound supports that often involve like being in group with each other, being in community with each other. We sort of know the only people in some ways who can give another young man of color permission to heal is another young man of color. Fascinating. And so we know that like young men can empower each other and give each other permission to engage, to be vulnerable, to heal, to do all these things. And that what happens in that kind of community is very often transformative and often the basis for more individual healing processes that may happen later, like with or without professionals. But we also know, like, our harm parties don't have to do anything if they don't want to, right? Like, if they just want to say, like, you work on transforming this person and call me in 15 months, that's their right. So, like, they didn't incur an obligation because they were hurt. And so the service plans for our harm parties vary from things that are incredibly intensive with regular, frequent engagement all the time to things that are very sparse because part of what they want is the thing to go away and for even us to go away with it, right? They want it to no longer be a centerpiece in their life. And so we respect very much their self-determination and determining both not just the nature but also the scope of our engagement with them.
And just so everyone knows, right, we've lifted up this whole idea about serving young men of color. We also serve young women as well. Mm-hmm. So I want you to know that. And many of whom, just like in the instance of Khalif Browder, we have a lot of young men of color coming to us. We have young Khalifa Browders, right, that are coming to us into our program. So I just wanted to make sure I qualified that by stating it out loud because we do serve women. I want to make sure I take some time now to kind of field some questions from the audience. I think it's before we wrap this up, right? We have some time, but I want to make sure I get some questions, and I guess what your questions will produce will be maybe some more dialogue to some other things. So we'll start with some questions. Yes?
When we get
sure.
So this way they can have it for
sure.
You know, you present a whole bunch of different ideas and thoughts that come to mind. I'm a documentary filmmaker, as I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. I'm doing a documentary on the state of empathy, and I've been doing a lot of documentaries on people with mental illness and people who have been in hospital, and I'm realizing that a lot of what's going on, the undercore is socialization. And that care is about caring, and that many of the people come from dysfunctional families and dysfunctional society and abuse, and they don't know any different. They have these survival mechanisms that they develop early on, and then all of a sudden, as they get older, they think they're going to work, and they don't, and they wind up both being harmed and not having enough sense to keep out of harm's way. And the point I want to make is two things. One is that I think we need to use those resilience as an engine to really empower ourselves to get beyond that. Because I've seen some amazing people who have come through prison, come through mental issues, and who are just brilliant. I learned from them. And so there's a lot to offer with people who have come through these circumstances, like yourselves. You know, so my question is, how can we create a society that has empathy for the individuals? Because I think you have to have empathy for yourself first before you can have it for somebody else. But how do we create a more empathetic society?
Maybe I'll start and then kick it to you. I mean, I would say that the sort of biggest, corrosive force on empathy in this country is white supremacy, right? Like, if there are a group of people who suffer from a failure of empathy, it is white people in America, right? And it has been for a very long time. And the process, I can only imagine what one would have had to tell oneself to think slavery was tolerable, to own a human and still love yourself at the end of the day, right? Like, the stories and the twists of, like, mind and heart and soul that white people in this country had to do and continue to have to do to say things like democracy here are profound, right? Like, we have to sever our relationship to the part of us that suffers when other people feel pain, or it is intolerable and we cannot face it, right? We are too afraid to face what we have done, right? And what we continue to do and everything we have gotten in exchange, right? Not just like the money and the accumulation, right? Like, my grandfather was an immigrant too. I'm lost people in the Holocaust too, right? Like, I understand all the ways we say we're not the white people who benefited, like, my grandpa weren't here neither, and I'm a white person and I benefit from it, right? Like, just Like, if just because your ancestors didn't plant the tree, if you're sitting under its shade, it's still your tree to answer for. And so I think the thing that is the biggest barrier to us being an empathetic culture is our complete aversion to dealing with our history, our complete aversion to telling the truth about what it is we have done and continue to do, and our complete avoidance of an accountability process, which would do that thing I talked about earlier, which is to help us as white folks deliver from that shame, right? Because as long as we are still ashamed, we know that shame is the biggest driver of violence. So as long as we still are ashamed of what we have done, we will continue to act it out as violence, as we always have. And so until we are accountable for the entire history and the present of the impacts of white supremacy in our country, then we will continue to carry that shame, and we will continue to hurt people out of it, and we will continue to fail to express like the basic human function of empathy. So the first thing I want to just be really clear when we're talking about who lacks empathy, like where I would focus my attention first. And it wouldn't be on poor folks of color. The second thing I would say, though, is that some of our participants will appear at first in conversation to not be empathetic, because you'll say things like, how do you think he felt when you stabbed him, or when you like put a gun to his head? And they'll be like, I don't know, normal, fine, cool. Right? And that's like on any screening instruments, it like sets off the like psychopathy box. You're like, oh shit. Like the social workers are like checking it, being like, ruh-roh. Like, you know, it's like that thing, right? Like this, that seems like an inability to connect with another human's feelings. But what do you do when you're being empathetic? Right? You generally, what we do as people is like, you tell me a thing that's happened to you. I think about the closest thing in my own experience, right? The closest approximate thing I can to what you've shared. And I think, how did I feel? And from that, I extrapolate something about how you must feel, right? Like, what's the closest I've got? How did I feel? Do I exaggerate or diminish it based on my sense of the relative seriousness, right? But I ask, how did I feel in a similar situation? And I use that as the basis to understand what you feel. In our culture, all we have told young men about their pain is that it's nothing. And in a different way, like we have told young men of color they are responsible for their own pain, and we've told young women of color that their pain doesn't exist, and thank God they're so strong to come through it, right? Like, we have told a story that, like, for young men, we say, like, what happened to you is nothing. What happened to you is normal. And so the young men of color who we work with who have been harmed, when they're hurt, the most available coping strategy, the one that is most consonant with the dehumanizing message of our culture, is like, it's cool, it's normal, it happens to everyone, it's fine, it's cool, it's okay. Like, the way men get through it is to say it didn't matter, that they felt fine. And so when we ask a young man, how do you think he felt when he had a gun to his head? And that young man says in his mind, well, I've had that done 5 times to me, and I felt fine. And then he answers, I bet he felt fine. It is not that he is not doing the empathy gesture. It's not that nobody be checking the little psychopathology box, right? He is doing that gesture, but when he minds his own experience, the thing that he encounters there is the complete devaluation of his pain and humanity that we have been responsible for generations. And so until we can say what happened to you was wrong, and your pain mattered when that happened, until somebody's own pain, then once somebody has gotten that validation, once somebody's gotten to do what Donnell describes, which is be like, actually, I'm close to tears right now, or actually cry it out, you ask that man how the other person felt, and he's like, that person's pain was so deep, he didn't think there was a way out, right? So when I think when we look to, and in that same way, it's the same thing, right? It means that the barrier to that empathy ultimately boils down to white supremacy in that second example, too.
And that's a perfect example, because when you really think about it, fundamentally, when you look at black-on-black violence, it's often a function of white-on-black violence, right? In this real white supremacist kind of way. And so just like you have a nervous system in the body, if that nervous system is cut out, there's an inability to feel. So if you have on the highest level, on the structural level, in this notion of white supremacy, has no notion of feeling, that passes down too, right, to those who are impacted by that. So they too don't feel. So if I shoot you and kill you, someone walks over the body, not my family, I don't care anything about that. But to repair that, nervous system, right? To restore it in different ways causes people to feel. And this is some of the work that we do at Common Justice, really restoring, right, this nervous system within people that cause them to become more sensitive by way of being responsible for their actions. I had some more questions. Donnell, do you want to say anything, or we'll... Okay, perfect. All right, I know someone else, they had their hand up here. See my colleagues, my former colleagues, Captain Neff and Dave from my husband. Just want to say hello over there. Hi, guys. I see you guys there. Yes. Yeah, sure. Please.
Hi, I'm Doremi. I have two questions for you guys. One's for Donnell. I wanted to ask how you were approached with the option to participate in Common Justice, who was involved when that happened. Right, because you assume that it's going to be a certain process to go to Rikers, but where did Common Justice come in with that? And then the second question is related to the Close Rikers campaign. I'm an avid supporter, but I'm concerned with kind of the other end of what happens once Rikers closes, and what it'll take for New York City or organizations like Common Justice to respond to that. Some ideas or areas where we need to invest that I've heard have been opening local community-based jails, speedy trials, preventative justice programs, and education reform. So I just wanted to see how, I guess it's a scaling question, right? What is happening now and how to scale when Rikers.
Well, one of the things is for certain, once Rikers is closed, we'll hire all of you to work with Common Justice to serve all of the people that's coming out of Rikers. No. But I'll turn the question over to Danielle and Donnell.
That one and
So basically the process, like when they first came into and I see them, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. So I would say I went to court. If they were there, I wasn't paying attention because I was scared as hell, right? So the first couple of times I probably didn't see them, but now that I see the process, I know they were around somewhere, right? Like ninjas. Yeah. They're my ninjas. So basically, I remember my lawyer saying somebody wanted to speak to me. Right, I actually got dragged in because of my brother, right? So I actually wasn't even old enough for it at that time, right? But because of my brother and the other gentleman, I got dragged in, right? Or should I say, I was blessed to be in that predicament, to get out of it. And somewhere down the line, one of the Common Justice employees came, right? The intake person, and she basically spoke to me. She was like, "So what did you do?" And I was like, well, I didn't do anything. It was just like a whole bunch of invisible guys. And they did it and I didn't do anything. She's like, okay, what did you do? You know what I mean? And after a while, I started to notice that the thing wasn't me particularly snitching on myself as much as me having accountability for what I did, right? And taking accountability for what I did. So when I started to see that and she wasn't backing off of that thing, I was like, yeah, so I did it. It was me. It was me in the camera. And I was sorry. So that was the first time I seen him. Did I trust him? No. I the whole time. I said the whole time, no. I was like, who are these people? What is the trick that they have for me? And what's going on, right? Because they're already saying a certain number that I'm going in for. So what, I never seen anybody step between the justice system and stop something from happening. I seen all my brothers and cousins go to jail. You know what I'm saying? So for somebody to come to me and promise me something that I never seen happen a day in my life, I did not believe it. I was like, no. But what's other options, right? And then after speaking to them and talking to them and hearing them ask me things about myself, right? And I'm like, wait a second, I did this wrong. I just did this thing to somebody. Why are you asking me about me? What I like? You know what I mean? Like, who does that inside of a courthouse, right? Sitting across from me behind the glass. Who does that, right? And from there, I was like, there's something different. I'm not gonna lie to you. I was like, there's something different. Let me take a risk, right? And then my brother was connected to it. And this other guy didn't know, right? But the one thing that we all knew is that we didn't want to be in Rikers, right? That we didn't want to be in this place. And if it came down to us having to see each other, because we knew we would have to see each other at some point in time in a circle, right? Because they tell you what you're going to go through. And being in that and knowing that I would see him, I rather him, which is a dude that's my brother now also, right? And we did plenty speaking engagements since then together. And I see his mother and she screams out down the street at me, "Hey, Donnell!"
She's a lot like
Yeah. She'll scream me out in a second, and I'll go, right? Because she gives. I'm still surprised at the love that came out of that circle, right? So the first time, just to answer your question, the first time I see Common Justice was inside, and I was locked up. I was scared. I was like, who is these people? There was a white person that came and seen me. It wasn't a so I was like, and basically that's how I met them, and that's how I took Common Justice. Yeah.
And do you remember her question?
Lowe's and Rikers.
Yes.
So I think the first thing and I will answer the question with respect for the complexity of this, but I want to say first is that we have to do a thing, like a mental, it's late in the day, so I'm saying a thing. We have to do a mental shift where we stop thinking about jails as something that solves a problem for us, that when they're not there, we're going to have to solve. Jails claim to solve problems. Jails create enormous problems. So jails create unemployment. So if two people are arrested for the same thing on the same day, and one gets bailed out by morning and they've missed an evening at work, they go back to a job. If another person is in for, say, 10 days, say they don't have a fancy job like ours where we have things like sick days and vacation days and reasonable people we deal with, like say they're working an hourly job and they don't show up for work for a week. When they come home, their job is gone. And when they go to try and get another job, they now have this open matter pending, so they're not getting a job. And like the vast majority of New Yorkers, like it is a tiny fraction of New Yorkers who have more in their savings account than their monthly rent. Yeah. And so when a month goes by without working, that person is now out of a home. And if that person was a parent, that person is now at risk of losing their child, either to another custodial parent, so they are no longer in the mix, or to the child welfare system. So they have lost, in the space of a week, they have lost their employment, they have lost their home, they have lost their family. And had they had $500 to post bail, they would have lost none of it.
Or two. Right?
Or $200. Or, money that other people have. Right? And so we have to understand that that's not something that is solved, right? It is generating homelessness. It is generating joblessness. It is breaking apart families. And so in some ways, all the resources we spend to respond to that homelessness and that unemployment and those broken families will be freed up for us to do something different, right? So that's one thing too. We have to also remember that if jails are drivers of violence, then Rikers is a source of violence, right? It is a place from which violence emanates and where it grows in New York. So when it is gone, we stand the chance of having a less violent city, of having safer neighborhoods. Like that is within reach for us. And the resources that we spend to tend to violence also stand to come back into the mix in a different way. And so we will need to do things, right? Like there's some people who will still be locked up and we'll need to have more community, like located jails. And like there's the whole math of how many people that's going to have to be depending on how brave we can be. And I mean brave politically, not in terms of safety. And so those questions, like those logistical questions are really important. But the thing we have to do is we have to say what drives crime. Like Mariam Cabo, who's one of my beloved colleagues and teachers, like when you ask what drives crime, it is different than the question what drives incarceration, right? Like what drives crime? And if it's poverty and if it's unemployment and if it's trauma, then we think about how do we reduce poverty, how do we reduce unemployment, how do we address trauma? And as we start to do that, we will become less and less dependent on a place like Rikers to do a job it is not built to do, and that it does poorly when we ask it to. And so the resources we get to reinvest, we also get to invest them in a way that is driven by a different set of values at that time, and in a way that actually we could do things like center crime survivors, the Close Rikers campaign is in the process of adopting the vision statement that emerged out of the Downstate Coalition for Crime Victims, for what crime victims want. From a political perspective, that's supposed to be enemy territory, right? And what's true is that those things are so aligned. They're about housing, economic opportunities, safety, some basic things, the things that we have invested in white community and divested from communities of color for generations in this country. And so as that alignment comes into focus, I think we can also do it in a way that fundamentally changes the landscape for crime survivors in New York.
I also want to be respectful to everyone having been here all day long, so you don't have to stand necessarily, right? But when you do have your question, you can stand up like in your seat. If we answer your question, you can sit down, right? So please, and then I'll field some more questions, all right?
So I started work in direct services, and I'm encountering people that I work with very closely who have secondary trauma, have been doing the work for decades. And because of that, I feel like there are certain times when they'll say things that are kind of like the equivalent of the joke of like how doctors make fun of death, where they're like, oh, this person's on drugs, like, haha, you know, and it's like, as someone who's not burnt out yet, it's like, it seems like really bad. And I'm trying to figure out, I have to work with them, and I really look up to a lot of the work they've been doing, and I can see the secondary trauma. What advice would you give to like combat that narrative and that tendency while also being respectful of all the years they've dedicated to this?
We should give that to our social worker.
Yeah, I know. I'll speak from experience and also being a social worker. I think what's important is self-care, right? We in the social work world, my friend and colleague over there, she's over there. She knows who I am. She's a social worker as well. And, you know, it's always about, she can stand up. Please stand up, right? Catherine, right, is a licensed clinical social worker. And, you know, so we always talk about this whole notion of self-care. And oftentimes people, those of us who work in direct service, move closer toward the dial of burnout, right? Because we've been immersed in the work for so long. We love it. We're passionate. But at some point, like, damn, I'm tired of this, right? But we don't get self-care. We don't check in. We don't have therapists, right? Especially black folk, right? We run from therapists, right? Because you're going to think we crazy, right? And we not, right? Human beings should consult other human beings for things that they may not have answers to sometimes. And so with regards to some advice, right, I would say to really challenge the narrative is like, why are we still doing the work, right? Our work is about really healing people, developing interventions for them in different ways, not giving them answers necessarily, but developing these interventions that will put them in a state of functionality and independence, right? And we're about caring for people, right? And I'm sensitive to all of the years that you've done, right? I care about that. I also care enough about you to say that we have to continue to care about people who can't care about themselves, right? That's one way I would frame it. And there are many different ways we can frame it, but that's how I would frame it. And if that person no longer wants to be in the work, then I care enough to say, well, maybe there may be a different space that you should be in because you're going to cause more damage than anything else, right? This gentleman had his hand up over there. Then I'm going to sweep across the room this way, right in the back. If you can speak loudly enough, because we're a small, motley little group, right? Having this fireside chat, right? So you can, okay, thank you very much. See, that's care, right? And he's moving us along. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
As someone who profoundly believes in restorative justice being built as an alternative and held as an alternative.
Sure.
I also want to think about how it often we get forced as advocates to present it as kind of a magic bullet. And as somebody my family's restorative process did not work out, in fact, it made it harder because I lost my ability to repress and like the rage then becomes really palpable and a new thing to navigate. And we also, as you articulated, restorative justice does not exist in a vacuum. We don't get to free it from economic stress, other compounded versions of trauma, on and on and on and on and on, trying to go to work every day, etc.
Sure.
So I was thinking, like, how, as advocates and as folks who really are placing this work on the cutting edge and building something that we know is light years better than what we're trying to get away from, how can we create, both in practice and in narrative, systemic versions of this? When our interpersonal stuff doesn't go well, we need to be able to go somewhere that doesn't force the advocates back into like, well, life without parole is better than the death penalty, or this 5-year sentence was better than this 15-year sentence. We know that is often becomes the kind of easy fallback and feels like an incremental pushing of the needle. We know that this other alternative is far better, But when it doesn't work, or when it compounds the pain, or when it goes terribly wrong, which it will on occasion, can there be some sort of systemic net that catches some of that and that's tangible, that we can also advocate for and point to as tangible, and create alternatives that are easy to speak of, especially for the folks who go through these experiences, who have the family members incarcerated, go through violence, and commit to staying square their whole life, don't have a narrative of having gone through this, and they're just sitting there in their own pain and resentment, being like, I've just tried to do well the whole time, and they're going to work and they're struggling. They often feel really left out and not called into this work either. So all of that said is how do we develop this in a more systemic, tangible way, and not with the idea that that's an easy question to answer, but what are steps into that?
Very good question, and I'll turn it to Danielle for some response. And I know we have maybe 10 minutes or so left, and so I'll try to sweep across after she answers to get like at least 4 more of you whose hands I saw raise.
I mean, honestly,
very good question.
I want to invite you to take this seat and answer that question, because it's clear that, you know, like, you've dealt deeply in this space, and I appreciate you bringing that. I mean, I think, and I'm sorry that the process didn't deliver to you what you deserve. And I think there is a first step of us all, those of us who are practitioners in this work, being rigorous as shit, right? Like, our participants go through at least 3 months of daily one-on-one preparation before sitting in the circle with a person who they hurt. And if they ain't ready, like, they aren't going, right? So there is also, like, there is a certain amount of rigor in the way we do restorative justice that can increase the likelihood that it will be the transformative thing it stands to be. It's still, you're right, won't always be that, even with that rigor. Some of that is that we have to be really honest about people going into it, about what it is there is. And that's part of what I said, why I used to say participatory, is like, because I would imagine your process was participatory, even if it wasn't restorative, right? That you got to participate in it. And to be really careful about overpromising. And that's something that our opponents in the system do, and we can't do it in response. And it's tempting because they say the thing we have will solve everything, and it's hard for us to respond by saying the thing we have will solve something sometime, right? It doesn't sound like it's a fair one. But we can't respond to that imbalance by lying, and particularly by lying to survivors about what we've got or don't have for them. But the other thing I think we have to do is we have to always be honest that these processes are, they're threatened and compromised by inequity and by structural racism and by poverty, right? That those things make it hard. So the fact that they work at all in that context is sort of crazy, right? The fact that anything at all can work in the context we have created in this country is extraordinary. But we have to understand those structural factors, not as excuses for the failure of our work, but as targets of our organizing at the same time that we organize to be able to provide these solutions. So we say these solutions are far better than what we currently have, and they will be at their best if and only if, like, we start to develop an equitable culture, right? And where anyone who is hurt, like whether, and I think about the young woman who asked the question earlier in the earlier plenary about, like, what if you don't want to call the police? Where do you go? Like a culture where anyone who is hurt has somewhere they can go and be met with support for their pain, whatever caused it, even if it was one of our interventions. And so we have to build a society where the availability of that is our new non-negotiable, as opposed to the sort of pervasiveness of punishment being the one thing we can't imagine letting go. But it's hard. It
is. It's really hard. And if we look more as a society at a public health framework to dealing with crime rather than a public safety model, it would address some of those things and make the process of restorative justice a bit easier for one to go through, right? If we focused on the economic health of an individual, the mental health, the social health, the familial health of an individual, those things are addressed, a person can go through a restorative justice kind of experience and not worry about those other stressors because they're in place, right? I'm going to sweep across. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sheesh. No one over here? 5. We're going to try to get 5 in 3 minutes. Could we do that?
Should we maybe take a couple at a time and see if we can?
Yeah, let's see if we get a couple right at a time. We'll do that.
We'll try and
Yes.
Oh, hi, I'll try to make this quick. My name is Angelique, and I work doing similar work that y'all do, court diversionary restorative justice work with juveniles who are first-time offenders, sort of things of a very different level than what you do.
Okay.
And we get our referrals from police and probation, as I'm sure that you do as well. And I'm wondering what sort of things that y'all do to address what happens sort of between the incident and when they're referred to you, aka, their interaction with courts and with police and things like that, and maybe how you can build trust, especially when they're referred through a system that they maybe don't trust.
Okay. The second person. And then there were two more people, I think, over there. You
Hi.
and you, Josh, in the back.
I wrote some notes. My question is specifically about domestic violence.
Okay.
My question is, what does restorative justice look like specifically in a situation where the harmed party is sometimes still at risk from further harm from the responsible party, and particularly in like the global context where violence against women is frequently not understood as harm, like not just legally, but like culturally too. Who's next?
You want to respond to those, Daniel? Those two? Or Donnell, you want to talk about that? And then we're going to get 2 questions after Donnell. You want to respond to a little bit? Sure.
Well, I would say one of the things that we do have is in the beginning of 3 months of the participant being in the program, right? And that's the rites of passage. Which basically is we talk about freedom. I'm trying to right there. My brain. I'm sorry, it's late in the day. But basically, what we do is we create a space where what we teach them in rites of passage. We create a space in which they can learn our culture and also build trust, right? And also build trust in that time. And also it helps from basically them having to go and basically be remands or anything else of that nature. We try to do that in the beginning. We try to sow in that the culture, the way we talk, our language, everything then, right? In those 3 weeks, so that they'll be more in sync with us and understand who we are as a people. And then, like I said, they don't trust this one, right? So we have to build that we are their team and we have their back. So we use that 3 months as that focus, and we call that the rites of passage.
And the domestic violence question is so hard. So it has been like we don't take domestic violence cases, though we certainly work with people who, in addition to the crimes they got arrested for, have also committed harm in their own homes or survived harm in their own homes or in their relationships. It's sort of a taboo in the domestic violence field to say you believe in restorative justice. I get all these calls where people are like, Danielle, I think we should do restorative justice for domestic violence. And I'm like, oh, someone, and they're and I'm like, someone else said that to me last week. Should I introduce you? And they're like, no. So there is this thing emerging in the domestic violence field more and more where I think what has been happening in a lot of places is coming to the surface where people are saying, like, there is something in that for us. And it's complicated, right? Safety planning in the context of restorative justice is complicated. The dynamics of power and control as they play out in a circle process, where when the question to the survivor is like, what should this person have to do to make right? And like all he has to do is sit like this, and like the list is cut in half, right? And in the reality, in some cases, he doesn't even need to sit like this because he's sat like that 15 times before. And so she already knows, or he, if it's a male survivor, already knows what it means. One of the strategies that I think has been really promising is involving surrogates, so that the person who makes the demands on the person who has committed harm is not their partner, but someone who has been similarly situated, because that person is not caught in the same dynamic. It's my belief, and this is not even really Common Justice's formally held belief, but my own, that for restorative justice to work in cases of domestic violence, you have to be really disciplined about making sure you're bringing to bear the moral force of a community, which sometimes circles do. But in a lot of restorative justice programs, the sort of presence of support people is optional, right? Like you invite family, you hope they come, you invite friends, they hope they come, but you move forward even if they can't. I think in domestic violence cases, that larger circle of support and accountability has to become non-negotiable. so that the commitments the responsible person is making have to be to people more than just the program and that person's partner, but to the people who witness them together in their daily lives, like who can be the one who says, if you get heated, call me and I'll go on a walk with you, like who are the person who she can call and hang up and they'll come over, you know, like where they develop like collaborative safety plans that are rooted in relationship. That's hard for nonprofits that are built in like the nonprofit industrial kind of way to do. But I think when we think about the possibility of restorative justice in domestic violence cases, we have to be honest about the potential risks it poses. We have to be honest about its limitations. But what we can't do is pretend that the court system is free of those risks or limitations. So I think often the resistance to it comes as like comparing it to something perfect. And sure, like compared to something perfect, it's shit. Compared to shit, it's like pretty good, you know? And so like we have to be real that the criminal justice system is often extraordinarily dangerous for survivors of domestic violence and often extremely inaccessible to survivors. And forget it if you're an undocumented survivor, and forget it if you're a survivor who has an open case or a felony conviction, and like and forget it if you're a survivor who wants the person changed but not incarcerated. Like the range of survivors who can actually get safety and justice through the system as we know it is so narrow. And so when we envision alternatives, I think the one thing we have to be disciplined about doing is not exaggerating the efficacy of our current set of tools.
And it's 5:17. I know folk want to go home. I'll take two more questions.
And we will vow to you that if you leave right now, we will not.
I neglected this side of the room. I'll take one from this side and one from this side. And I want to be fair, not because Catherine is my colleague and friend, but no one from this side really, right? No one from this side really asks a question. So I'll field a question from here. Oh my goodness. All right, we'll take those two combined, right? And then Catherine, that's it. We want to get you out. We want to be disciplined, right? And stay committed to ending this day the way it's supposed to.
Acknowledging the shortcomings of the criminal justice system as it is and reimagining a future where restorative justice is our most prominent form of justice, are there limits that you see to where restorative justice could play a role if the violence is too pervasive, if there are too many, if the crime or crimes has not one direct victim, let's say, of like financial crimes, less like violence. I think domestic violence is a great example of this because it's so pervasive. So there are imagined limits that you see, and if so, what would be the alternative to that?
And your question, sir?
My name's Danny. I'm a former arts program intern at Rikers with the DOC, so I laid witness to the ugliness. And basically, I want to know, you mentioned how you hope that sometimes if the family decides to come or if a surrogate's able to be provided, if not, you move on. So I want to know what unilateral restorative justice looks like and accountability with just the person, the responsible party themselves. And is it sustainable within a prison abolitionist framework?
Okay. And then Catherine, we'll take your question.
Very quickly. At what point Oh, thank you. Congratulations on the amazing work you're all doing. At what point do harmed parties have the opportunity to learn they can participate in the process of restorative justice?
Okay.
So I'll try and address those first two together because I think they're related. We never move forward in a unilateral process. So what we do sometimes do is move forward if people's family members won't come. But the harm party is either always present or represented by a surrogate. And so the harm party, and a surrogate is someone who's been through something similar, who's agreed to represent the harm party in that process. Sometimes harm parties don't want to be in the room with the person who hurt them. Sometimes that's about fear. Sometimes it's about a desire. They've moved out of state. They're dealing with their own things. It is no longer the most serious concern in their lives, or they do not want to face that person personally. And they get the option to meet with a surrogate. They can meet with them and talk about it. They can express what they want the agreements to be. They can say, look, it's good. I trust you. They can just describe what their experience was, but not necessarily the response they want. They can write a letter and have it read. They can write questions and be consulted halfway through. Like they can do basically any way they want to show up in that process, they can show up. So we never do a process without the harm parties present. One thing we have started to do is that when people don't have support people, we've started to even bring in like surrogate support people, right? So we've started to bring in community members or people from other programs, program graduates, to serve as support people when folks don't have their own folks who want to show up with them. We had one harm party whose support person was a harm party who had been through the program before him, and they didn't know each other before then, but he wanted like someone else who shared his experience in the room. But we never do it unilaterally in that way. In terms of how it connects to an abolitionist framework, I think it also that connects to like restorative justice is just not going to be everything for everything. Like it isn't.
Part of it.
It's fabulous. It doesn't mean it's like, I think chocolate is fabulous. It's not everything. Like, it's close, but not everything. Like, you need, like, some nutrients, too. That was a bad analogy. I think restorative justice is more nutritious than chocolate, probably. It's been a long day. So we have to be, the way I think about like my own abolitionism, for example, is prison abolition is not a strategy, it's a goal, right? We say prisons are ineffective and harmful and inconsistent with human dignity, which means overall we should aim to have fewer things in our society that are ineffective, harmful, and inconsistent with human dignity, and super expensive if that's your concern. And what that does is it generates, but the thing prisons should do is they should hold people we can't otherwise safely hold in our communities. That's not an argument for prison's existence. That generates a task list for us, right? Who are all the people who we can't safely hold in our communities, and for what? And how do we develop capacity to do that, right? And then the people who are still in prison should be the people that we as a community say like, oh, we don't know what to do. And then we should focus our attention and like the creativity and leadership and all the stuff in this room on what we do about those, right? Like there will be groups of cases that I'll have no idea what to do about, and someone else will, right? And so for me, I was like, I looked at the list of people who were locked up, who we couldn't safely hold in our community, and I was like, oh, people who commit this kind of violence felony, we can do that. Like, we'll take those, right? Like, bring them to us. Like, we will hold them. And they will become people who can hold others in the way Donnell described, like replicating that in their communities. And so I think the way I think about abolition as a task list, right? Like and the work as being all of ours, not as a philosophy that we get like, a full back tattoo and street cred for believing, but as a way of shaping our understanding of what our collective work is. Did that get all the questions? No, there was
Catherine?
When
harm parties.
They get a choice at the beginning.
Sure.
So the response parties don't get in the program without their consent.
Is that introduced by the DA's office post-arrest?
It's all post-indictment. And someone from the DA's office calls and says, a lady from a program is going to call you. Cool. And people are like, cool. And then, that's not true. The Victim Service Unit from the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office reaches out to the harm party to get their consent to share their information with us. And then our outreach staff reaches out to the harm parties, tells them they are entitled to our services no matter what they choose about the responsible party entering the program or not, and talks with them about whether they want the responsible party to go to prison or come to common justice. 90% of crime victims who are given that choice choose common justice. 90%.
And so on behalf of Common Justice, right, we just want to give Danielle and Donnell a nice warm round of applause. And on behalf of Common Justice, we really want to thank all of you for coming out and staying out to support. We want to thank Kathy Boudin and Cheryl Wilkins and Cameron and others from the Center for Justice of Columbia for organizing this. And we want to lastly thank Josh, right, our film person back there, who did have a question, right? And I don't know because he's filmed all of this, and you'll have access to watching this later right. to hear his question if he wanted to, because he did have his hand up. You'll find us perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Continue to have an amazing weekend. It's a lot of work to do. Take care of yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
See you in the streets.
Oh, yeah. And Danielle has also put out a report. Oh, yeah. So please, if you want to share, Danielle, how they can access the report she's put out,
It's called Accounting for Violence, How to Increase Safety and Reduce Our Failed Reliance on Mass Incarceration. So you can find it on the Vera Institute's website, and you can also Google Danielle Serrett Accounting for Violence, probably. You all are, many of you in this room are younger than me. You know how to
Should
do
know.
better than I do. But it's on Vera's website, and would love your reading, sharing, thinking about it.
Please read it.
Telling us about ourselves if you see in it that doesn't ring true.
Thank you.